Welcome to another episode of Books and Bites. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into Malcolm Gladwell's David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants.
Oh, yeah. I've heard good things about that one.
Yeah. So our mission today is to unpack Gladwell's arguments and see what, resonates with us.
Okay.
We're going to explore some really interesting historical examples, some psychological concepts, and some compelling stories to challenge how we usually think about power and success. So what's immediately striking about this book is how Gladwell challenges how we normally think about advantages. Like, he says that what we think of as a strength might actually hide a weakness.
Okay.
And, what we think is a weakness could actually turn into a strength.
Yeah, like turning those weaknesses into opportunity.
Exactly. And it just really makes you question, like how we judge things on the surface.
Absolutely.
So let's start with the story that gives the book its title, David and Goliath.
Everyone knows David and Goliath.
But Gladwell looks at it in a totally new way.
How so?
Well, he says that Goliath might not have been the unbeatable giant that we usually think of.
Really?
Yeah. Gladwell thinks that Goliath might have had acromegaly.
Acromegaly.
Yeah, it's a condition that could explain why he was so big.
Okay.
But it can also cause problems with vision and make you slow and clumsy.
Oh, wow. So, even though Goliath was this huge giant, he may have had some serious disadvantages.
Exactly. And imagine facing this giant in heavy armor who can't even see you properly.
The whole story changes when you look at it like that.
Right.
Right?
And then you have David's weapon, like a simple sling.
Yeah. Seems pretty basic compared to a sword and shield.
But Gladwell points out that in the hands of a skilled shepherd like David, a sling could be incredibly powerful and accurate.
Huh. So David's actually got this kind of secret weapon.
Yeah, and Goliath probably expected a regular hand-to-hand fight. So he's totally caught off guard by this projectile attack.
I see.
So David's unconventional approach, what seems like a weakness, becomes his greatest strength.
And that sets the stage for the whole book, really.
It does, and it leads us to one of Gladwell's most important ideas, which is desirable difficulty.
Desirable difficulty. That sounds kind of strange.
I know, right? It sounds counterintuitive, but the idea is that challenges and obstacles can actually help us succeed in the long run.
Really?
Yeah. They force us to think outside the box, to be more creative, and to develop resilience.
Yeah.
Things that we might not learn if everything was always easy.
I guess that makes sense.
And one example he uses is dyslexia among successful entrepreneurs.
Oh, interesting.
People like Richard Branson and Charles Schwab, they struggled with reading and writing.
Right.
But Gladwell says those challenges forced them to become really good at other things.
Like what?
Might be great at delegating or seeing the big picture or communicating verbally.
I see.
They had to find ways to compensate. And in doing so, they developed these unique perspectives and problem-solving skills.
So their weakness actually helped them become successful entrepreneurs.
Exactly. And then Gladwell introduces this other cool concept called the inverted U-curve.
The inverted U-curve.
Yeah. It basically says that having more of something good isn't always better. We often think that the more resources we have, the better the outcome will be.
Yeah, that's pretty natural to think.
But this inverted U-curve shows that there's a sweet spot.
Like a tipping point.
Exactly. And after that point, having even more can actually start to hurt us.
Interesting.
And he used the example of class size.
Okay.
Most people think smaller classes are always better for learning, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
But Gladwell points to research showing that once classes get too small, the advantages can disappear. Yeah, you might lose some of that dynamic interaction, the diverse perspectives, and the peer learning that happens in slightly larger, more diverse groups.
So there's a balance to be struck.
Exactly, and it makes you think about other areas where this might apply.
Right, like maybe having too much money or even too much parental involvement.
Yeah. Too much of anything can stifle independence or creativity.
So even though something might seem good on the surface, there can be downsides to having too much of it.
Absolutely. And this idea actually connects to Gladwell's exploration of how power can be an illusion. Those who seem to hold all the cards might actually be really vulnerable.
Okay.
And he uses the example of the British during the Troubles in Northern Ireland.
Right. They had all the military and political power.
But Gladwell argues that their harsh tactics often backfire.
In what way?
Well, their use of overwhelming force just created more resentment and resistance.
Oh, I see.
Their perceived strength blinded them to the fact that their approach was actually counterproductive.
So even though they had all the power, they weren't using it effectively.
Exactly. And this brings us to the importance of legitimacy and moral authority,
Okay.
which Gladwell explores through the civil rights movement.
That's a really interesting contrast.
It is. And think about Martin Luther King Jr.'s strategy in Birmingham.
Right. Using nonviolent protest against such blatant injustice.
He deliberately chose a peaceful approach to expose the brutality of segregation.
And by doing so, he appealed to a sense of morality.
Exactly. And that ultimately shifted public opinion.
So even though he seemed to lack power, his moral authority was incredibly strong.
It really shows how a position of perceived weakness can be so much more powerful than just brute force.
And it leads to lasting change.
And Gladwell tells this amazing story about Dr. Emil Freireich and his groundbreaking work with childhood leukemia.
Okay, I don't know much about him.
Well, he was kind of an outsider in the medical world.
Okay.
And that allowed him to challenge conventional thinking for a disease that was considered almost incurable at the time.
Wow, that's pretty brave.
And at first he faced a lot of resistance from his peers.
You know, people don't always like it when you challenge the status quo.
But his innovative treatments led to a huge increase in survival rates for children with leukemia.
That's incredible.
It is. And Gladwell argues that his outsider status, the fact that he wasn't bound by traditional thinking, was a key factor in his breakthroughs.
So being an underdog actually helped him see new possibilities.
Exactly. And this connects to the idea that resilience can be forged in difficult circumstances,
Okay.
which Gladwell explores with the example of London during the Blitz.
That was a really tough time.
It was, but it's fascinating how the constant bombing didn't break the spirit of Londoners.
Yeah, you'd think it would have the opposite effect.
Right, but instead it seemed to create this sense of unity and resilience.
They found strength in shared adversity.
Exactly, and Gladwell draws on this concept called the cohort effect, which suggests that going through this shared hardship actually strengthened their collective resolve.
They had to rely on each other to survive.
They did, and they discovered this capacity for endurance and mutual support that might not have emerged otherwise.
So, in a way, the hardship brought them closer together.
It did, and it's a powerful example of how facing adversity can make us mentally tougher.
Right. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
And this idea of resilience being built through struggle leads us to the inspiring story of Pastor André Trocmé.
What did he do?
He was in Nazi-occupied France, and he helped save thousands of Jewish refugees.
Wow, that's incredibly brave.
It is, and Gladwell suggests that Trocmé's own experiences with loss and hardship might have shaped his deep moral convictions.
You know, his own personal struggle.
Exactly, and that might have fueled his unwavering commitment to protecting the vulnerable, even in the face of such danger.
I can see that.
So even though he was an underdog in a really dangerous situation, he found the strength to do what he thought was right.
That's a really powerful story.
It is. And finally, Gladwell looks at how underdogs can win by changing the rules of the game.
Okay, how so?
He uses the Vietnam War as an example.
Oh, right.
So the Viet Cong were facing this incredibly powerful U.S. military.
Yeah, classic David and Goliath scenario.
Exactly. And they knew they couldn't win a traditional war.
So what did they do?
They adopted guerrilla warfare tactics.
Right, using the terrain to their advantage.
Exactly. And they blended in with the local population, so the U.S. couldn't even tell who was a combatant and who wasn't.
They completely changed the rules.
They did. And they effectively neutralized the U.S.'s advantages by refusing to fight on their terms.
So even though they were outmatched, they found a way to win?
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
a perfect example of how being an underdog can force you to think differently.
And to find creative solutions.
Exactly. So in the end, David and Goliath really makes us rethink what it means to be strong or weak.
Right, it challenges our assumptions.
Gladwell shows us that advantages can be deceptive and disadvantages can be empowering.
And that underdogs often succeed by thinking outside the box and challenging the status quo.
So as we've explored Gladwell's David and Goliath, we see a really compelling argument for reevaluating how we perceive strength and weakness.
It's a great reminder that things aren't always what they seem.
For you, the listener, this offers a fascinating perspective on challenges you might face or advantages you might overlook.
Right.
It encourages us to consider that what appears to be a setback could actually be an opportunity for innovation and unexpected success. To delve even deeper into these ideas and explore Gladwell's engaging storytelling, be sure to grab a copy of David and Goliath from the link in the description. And if you enjoyed this exploration of how underdogs can triumph, subscribe to Books and Bites for more insightful deep dives into fascinating books,